Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 3. This week, we're going to be doing 2 chapters. We have a couple of times during the semester where we do multiple chapters in a week. And I know it means it's a little bit heavy on the reading and also on getting through the lecture. So as always, put me on on double speed or whatever it is you need to do if you feel like that's the most effective thing for you. I'm going to ask that you make sure you show up for the very end of the second lecture on magazines because that's where I'm going to talk you through the assignments for the week. So in this first chapter on newspapers, we're going to learn about the history of the newspaper, its expansion to wider readerships. Pay attention to things like the history of the penny press. That's going to come up in some of your assignments. Revisit the important influence of yellow journalism, how it ties into some of the things that happen in contemporary journalism. We're going to look at modes and roles of journalism in democracy and consider the structures of newspapers and newsrooms and who gets to participate in those spaces and who's represented in the ideas and opinions that appear in the news. Examine the effects of the digital age on the contemporary news landscape. This is a big one. So this is going to show up in your video from John Oliver, who explains the really big impacts of what it means to have digital commerce essentially running news media now. And finally, we're going to consider the importance of the news in the lives of citizens and alternative news sources in the modern age of the news. So our first big question is, why does it matter? I think that you guys know how much the news matters because you live in a world that is really different than previous generations because you are steeped in constant information about current events. To an extent, I think sometimes that makes it feel like it's overwhelming. And so people maybe even kind of turn away from looking at news sources because there's so much of it, which is a very different experience than people have had in the past. In the past, there was a hunger for information because regular everyday people didn't have a ton of access to it. So this is one of the important things about the newspaper and what we're going to be thinking about this week. And as we look at the history of newspapers and magazines, and the growth of access to news for everyday people. News obviously predates the existence of a paper. Again, we talked in our first week about how before mass media, there were other forms of communication. And so a lot of the ways people would get news would be through public events. So things like attending local community meetings in grange halls or through churches. Before the existence of newspapers, and we're going to look at how they start to grow in the late 17th century in the United States, there were other ways that people accessed information, but it was, of course, limited. And as we talked about with the printing press and books last week, always limited by who gave you the information and their perspective and interests and intentions. That's not to say that those are also not influences in the newspaper, but there's something profoundly different about the ability to have multiple sources of news and perspectives rather than only relying on one or two spoken voices of community leaders in your immediate vicinity for understanding what was happening in the wider world. So just try to keep that in mind as you think about this and understand that the sort of glut of information that is part of the world you live in is very different from the one that led up to the emergence of the newspaper. The first colonial newspaper in what would become the United States was called Public Occurrences, which covered both foreign and domestic affairs. It only had one issue in 1690, so we'll talk a little bit about format in a later part of this lecture, but the idea is these things were massive. They often covered a lot, and it wasn't nearly as timely because of the time it took to produce a paper and also distribute it. Another important newspaper was the Pennsylvania Gazette, and this was run by Benjamin Franklin. That paper was supported by subsidies from advertisers to a small extent, but the majority of how early papers were run was that they were funded largely by political parties, sort of like sponsorships are today. And in that sense, newspapers also functioned a little bit like newsletters for political parties because they had so much sway versus our experience of the news, which is funded by diverse bodies of advertising. It doesn't mean that they aren't biased, but it's a different structure. The New York Weekly Journal was one of the first longer running newspapers in the United States and became critical to our development of the First Amendment because the owner was sued for defaming the then governor of New York based on some of the things written in the paper. And the judge at the time ruled that it was okay for newspapers to critique public figures so long as they could show that their stories were based in evidence. And this decision went on to be foundational to the First Amendment. This is going to be important for us too when we get into our week on media and the law, where we're going to look at issues around things like libel and defamation and how those things work in relationship to media. So there were officially two forms in the early papers in the United States. There were political papers, which I just described, partisan presses aligned with political parties and their groups and interests, and commercial papers, which served the interests of businesses and business leaders. Of course, there's some overlap in this, but the idea is a commercial press was about the goings on in the business world. And so their audiences were different, their funding sources were different. News readership was across both of these, though, primarily made up of wealthy white men, right? That was sort of the standard expectation of who the audience was that newspapers were being written for. A real expansion on who readership is imagined to be and who has access to newspapers doesn't really come until the penny press era. So this is also when newspapers officially become, our textbook argues, mass media, right? This is when a large portion of the population starts to have access to newspapers. And what made penny press papers really different was a lot of distinctions, not only in the content, but the format of the paper. So if you guys choose to do one of the writing assignments this week, one of them is on looking at format and how format impacts how we understand information. When we were talking about the partisan papers or the large commercial papers that were available primarily for people in business, so the merchant classes, those were huge papers. They needed to be laid out on a giant wooden desk. And often the print was so small that even though the paper was that big, you still needed to read it with a magnifying glass because they were trying to fit so much information in. And that's obviously something that's not available to everyone, right? And they were expensive because of all of that. And the penny press was really innovative because first they were sold for a penny, and that's why they were called penny papers. So they were much more affordable for people, but also the scale of the paper was completely different. This was a paper that was small enough to be folded up and stuck in your back pocket. So if you look at the format of what we see now in tabloid papers, if you go into a grocery store, it doesn't have the many pages like, say, the New York Times does, that needs to be folded out like this way first and then this way in order to be able to read all of it. The New York Times is much closer to these kinds of big broadsheet papers that would have been available to people in the partisan presses and the early commercial presses. A penny press paper was something that you could, like I said, put in your back pocket. You could buy it on the street. You could bring it on in the train with you. This is the same time period we're starting to have a lot of innovation in public transit as well. So people are taking trolleys and trains. And this is time for people to have access to read. There's suddenly like downtime for working class people. So the penny press really radically changes who has access to the news. This also means that it changes the kind of news that gets reported because it's appealing to a different audience. There are still papers functioning today that were part of the penny press newspaper era. The Associated Press, the New York Sun, and the New York Morning Herald were all born of the penny press time, and each was innovative in its own way. The Associated Press was the first major news service which focused on brief news updates rather than whole news stories. So it was kind of like a digest or a TLDR, like you got a bullet-pointed sense of what was going on in the world. The New York Sun pioneered human interest stories as part of the news, and the New York Morning Herald was one of the first to notably gear their content more towards middle-class and working-class readers in their time, which meant they would be covering issues that were important to workers and things like that. So I've also included here some info for you, and this is in your optional reading for the week. The Sun and the Moon is the story of a scandal around the New York Sun based on their reporting a discovery of people living on the moon that had wings, and it's sort of like a lot of the things we think about as part of contemporary tabloid news, but it also explains a lot about how penny papers worked. They had a lot of serialized fiction inside of them, so when we were thinking about penny dreadfuls and things like that in our book week, those kinds of serialized, often highly dramatic stories also appeared in newspapers as a way to pull in more readership, especially middle and working class readers. But what happened in this case is that what was a fantastical story ended up being reported as if it was a scientific discovery, which had a lot to do with the time period and the rapid advances of science and people's willingness to believe extreme things as potentially real because the whole world was changing so fast. The Industrial Revolution was radically transforming cities, so a lot of things seemed believable. There was also an issue with the way penny presses worked. So instead of having a team of staff writers, which a larger paper might have access to, these were upstarts. People decided to make these things in pretty creative ways, and they often basically copy-pasted stories from each other. So they sort of stole stories from one another. And so something that made a mistake in one paper was reported as a scientific discovery could easily be reproduced across a whole bunch of different ones. And then suddenly you have the big moment that seems to be across all these newspapers, this fictional narrative of what's happening. But in the case of The Sun and the Moon, it was also, there's a lot of great fun stuff in here. If any of you are interested in like Edgar Allan Poe or P.T. Barnum, there's a lot of overlap with some of those guys and those histories of emergent entertainment styles and how they intersected with the penny press. It's a great story if you want to read it. There's also a good podcast about it. Check it out if you like it. So in this world of different kinds of new audiences and new kinds of content going into newspapers to appeal to wider audiences, we have the emergence of yellow journalism, which we'll talk even more about in the magazine section. So yellow journalism is defined as overly dramatic and sensationalized stories and tactics in news that focus on investigative journalism and human interest stories and crime reporting. What that means is it covers a lot of different things. The term yellow journalism can equally refer to true crime stuff, but it also can refer to investigative journalism that was looking into human rights abuses in the workforce. It was anything that was about trying to garner a lot of attention to a story or an issue, as opposed to, again, if we think back to what would have been in business papers and partisan papers that are focused on the ruling classes and trying to get them up to par on what's happening, right? They're not trying to draw attention to anything that might critically need to change. So yellow journalism is a tough word because in some ways it's very pejorative, right? It sort of says like, oh, this is negative and has had some negative impacts. In fact, people refer to it as the precursor to fake news, but it's not that simple, right? It's not that yellow journalism was always false, right? It's not that. So something like the moon hoax could theoretically fall under yellow journalism. However, so did research into the violations and abuses within the meatpacking industry that led to huge worker reform that was covered in yellow journalism presses. The name yellow journalism comes from this kid here, this little cartoon I just wanted to point out to you guys. This guy's called the Yellow Kid, and he was a figure in a comic, a famous comic strip at the time, which featured this character called the Yellow Kid. And the New York World and the New York Journal continually tried to steal this comic back and forth from one another and the person who created it because he was super popular, right? So this is really about the beginning of thinking about what it means to appeal to audience interest as opposed to straight presentation of information to an already interested class. This is about trying to compete for reader interest in a way that had never been seen before. So yellow journalism comes out of this competitive market for readership and the need to constantly offer new and interesting stories, but also appeal to the human interests of local communities and supply entertainment for people. So again, it's a complicated thing. It's both good and bad in some ways. So yellow journalism prevails through much of the 19th century. And in the earliest 20th centuries, we start to see a kind of backlash to yellow journalism and its sensationalist tactics. And this comes in the form of objective journalism, suggesting that it's important for journalism to emphasize objectivity or the ability to distinguish fact from opinion in the news in the style of how it's written and structured, right? So how a story is constructed. Objective journalism, it uses an inverted pyramid style, which you can see illustrated here and your book describes in more detail. This is something we actually still teach in journalism classes in order to try and emphasize facts of the story over commentary or details that are seen to be sort of ephemeral. This sort of journalism, although still standard to what's taught in most journalism schools, including here at Sky, has come under some scrutiny because being objective is much more difficult than we often think it is. In deciding what is fact and what is truth is often influenced by our background, our cultural context, our personal beliefs, etc., which means that facts aren't clear cut or easy to define sometimes, right? What is our opinion? What is our framing of a story? Changes the meaning of a story, even if we deliver the same set of facts, right? So this is a critical question for all of us to think about in the contemporary moment, too. We're in a complicated time where objectivity is sort of seen as being under threat, and people are anxious about what is truth and what is verifiable fact and where people's opinions end and fact begins. And so this is something that you guys are experiencing that's not very different in some ways from what was happening during the yellow journalism period. We see a lot of sensationalism, what's referred to as clickbait in contemporary news journalism, and a real kind of re-elevation of the idea of what should be objective journalism. But again, it's just important to always keep in mind that objectivity is a tenuous and complicated thing and is not necessarily achievable in the way that people want to imagine it is. One form of journalism that started to push back against objective journalism was interpretive journalism, because what this aimed to do was to explain key issues and events and place them in a broader context. So rather than just listing facts and assuming that that's something everyone's going to understand and perceive in the same way, this model was used to convey the surrounding information that would help someone understand the impact of the facts that were being delivered in a story. This model has been popularly used in broadcast news, for example, not in so much in our contemporary era. So interpretive journalism appears in the 1920s. And by the 1930s, we also see another form of journalism that pushes back against objectivity journalism, which is literary journalism, defined by bringing fictional storytelling techniques to the writing and the telling of the news. These are often longer pieces of writing. They're more narrative. This form of journalism rejects the idea of journalistic objectivity in the same way that interpretive journalism does, but it also argues that the news is most compelling when it's presented with a perspective and a point of view. So it adopts this more narrative format for telling the news, and it's less concerned with the order of facts and that kind of pyramid style. Some famous people who've done this kind of work in the past have been Joan Didion, if you guys have ever encountered her books. It's often a pretty enjoyable read. Literary journalism is something that we are still very much involved in, and you see this a lot in book format journalistic projects that take a number of years to do investigative journalism on a specific story. So in addition to the expansion of interpretive journalism and literary journalism, we're also starting to see expansions of audiences being appealed to and of who's starting to tell stories. In the 20th century, newspapers emerged that oriented themselves towards particular audiences and communities that were often neglected in mainstream press. Examples of this include newspapers geared towards particular ethnic groups, like the Black Press, which you'll have an option to watch a documentary and write about for our writing analysis this week, or Indigenous papers, and papers geared towards women or created to serve queer communities. The underground presses, as it's commonly known, worked to question the mainstream political parties and values, and often questioned the privileging of different audiences and tried instead to highlight audiences that fell outside of the popular press. Another important distinction the authors emphasize in our chapter is the difference in roles that newspapers played in the 20th century. So there are two broad categories of roles that newspapers have played. The first is consensus-oriented, which tried to focus on issues seen as relevant to a large number of people within a certain locality. Conflict-oriented journalism, on the other hand, emphasized things that might deviate from norms or people's local experiences through conflicts that arise between topics and people's own ideals and understandings and beliefs. So often more sensational in some of the ways that we saw important to yellow journalism, but writ large on about big social issues very often, and to draw distinctions between communities in ways that were often quite problematic. There are also some important regulatory factors that influence the news in the 20th century and now the 21st. Concerns about the decline of newspapers and dissenting viewpoints gave rise to the Newspaper Preservation Act in 1970, which allowed for the creation of what are called joint operating agreements, or JOAs. JOAs allowed newspapers that had failing business models to join their business and production together with other newspapers. So it's a kind of conglomeration while still maintaining their own news operations. By 2016, only 5 JOAs currently remained in place, and the purpose of these was to allow papers that may not have been able to afford to financially support themselves to continue to exist and provide alternative news points. So often these are not our large-scale, well-funded papers. The concern with that is if newspapers couldn't afford the cost of production, that those ideas would disappear from the news landscape, and people wouldn't be exposed to as many different or dissenting views and would only be exposed to those ideas and views that came from really successful papers who had a lot of financial backing. So in order to allow for more diverse types of news to exist, this agreement model of the JOA came about. There are other important features of the news that change in the 20th century, especially around the operations of the news. And the first of these is around the concept of the news hole, the space available for actual news in a paper. So you might not realize it, but only about 30 to 50% of a newspaper is actually news, is in the news hole. The rest of it is advertising. Advertising has been critical to the operations of newspapers with some very serious effects on the kinds of stories that can be told. Another thing that starts to shift is the way that staff are organized. So broadsheets were primarily written by editors. These things really shift drastically in the 20th century. Publishers and owners of newspapers become far less involved in the regular reporting. Editors and assistant editors come about to be intermediary managers between the interests of the editors and owners, and a growing pool of what are thought of as staff reporters who actually go out and get the information and write the stories that appear in the newspapers and news sites. Wire services like the Associated Press were pioneered in the 19th century, and increasingly these wire services have come to supplant local news coverage. Many local newspapers use something called feature syndication, where work like political writing, cartoons, self-help columns are all sourced from a main source and can be picked up by local papers and reproduced. Typically, syndicates will be in larger, more metropolitan or urban areas and have bigger budgets and can afford to have more news content. And then local papers subscribe to these syndicates in order to be able to adapt and adopt the content and use it in their own smaller local papers, thereby often replacing local reporters who have interests in covering the local news. This allowed local papers to carry news stories that they might not be able to afford otherwise, but it also means that the story that gets written in the local news context comes from a very large space with a different set of interests. In the 20th century, newspaper ownership also changes somewhat. So newspaper had been popular around the 1920s, but started to decline, was then accelerated because of the digital turn in news when in the late 1900s and early 2000s, where so people were reading news on other sort of platforms and getting their news through other venues. So newspapers struggled to gain the ad revenue that had previously worked to support them. And many papers from chains begin to be sold off. So these papers are consolidating. So certain smaller branches are disappearing and just becoming localized versions of bigger newspapers. And this causes a huge elimination of local journalist jobs. This ties in also with the syndication that we just mentioned. Readership decline predated the digital era and was a problem for print media news in the 20th century overall, as many of the declines of newspaper readership have been attributed to the introduction of other technologies that we'll be looking at more in the next couple of weeks. So radio and television, which would also carry the news, and people started to prefer listening to newscasters rather than reading newspapers. So globally, an interesting trend, though, has been that while newspaper readership has been declining in the United States, globally it has continued to increase. Another interesting trend is that even while readership decreased, advertising revenue has increased, which is what allows most newspapers to stay afloat. So we can have less readers, but because people are spending more on advertising, strangely considering there are less people looking at that advertising, it continues nonetheless to still stay afloat. Some of this may have to do with the fact that we start having advertising into other spaces. This has also now started to shift in the digital era because we're starting to have more digital advertising methods. The news has also undergone some important transformations in the digital age. So even though declines in readership and other issues even predate the digital age, things are accelerated through the digital. Instead of relying on a physical paper in the morning, people are used to getting their news constantly throughout the day, often through alerts on our phones, which means the news is now always on. It works to speed up the news cycle as it's no longer on a set daily schedule or even twice daily, as was often the case through a lot of the 20th century. People expect the news more frequently and that it can be accessed a lot more easily. And as we'll talk about in a minute, also for free. There's also been a positive increased emphasis in the digital age on the possibility of reading non-traditional voices in the news. So we no longer get the news only from newspapers, but instead from blogs and YouTube videos and other social media content producers that we see on our feeds and from our friends being shared. And this can be very positive in some ways and can give us some great voices we might not hear. And so we'll talk a little bit in a minute about citizen journalism and how important it is to get voices that might not get to appear through newspapers. And yet at the same time, it also opens us up to a lot of potential risks of fake news. And so one of the things you'll be listening to this week is an episode of a podcast called Reveal, an investigative journalism podcast that looks at the story of Pizzagate and how fake news blows up the way that it does. And a lot of that happens, of course, because of a certain mistrust in the large-scale paper. So the previous model of the news being centralized in newspapers and one type of media doesn't really exist in the digital age in the same way. Newspapers face many dilemmas in the digital era, but there are also a lot of advantages, or at least potential advantages for digital news. There's unlimited space. There's the opportunity for immediate updates and availability to link to other stories and content and even resources in the case of health or as we'd seen during COVID. And yet at the same time, a lot of what we see too is the possible problematics about digital affordances and access. So if we lose newspapers, and as we'll talk about when we get to television, we're also losing local broadcast news, resources that people were informed about are now primarily available through digital content, which is not equally available to everyone. Modern newsrooms are also trying new methods to constantly keep up with the expansion of the digital era. And one of these has been the expansion of the use of what we call data news and analytics that help make them better at making decisions about content and topics that resonate with people. So using algorithmic like structures, but it's also about how we're presenting information. So if we think about interpretive journalism or literary journalism, it's often said that we're now in the age of data journalism, in which we're often presented with tables and charts and lots of information. And we saw a lot of this, of course, during COVID, which has had a huge impact on the expansion of data journalism. A lot of the challenges facing newspapers or news sites today and their attempts to address them and the potential dangers of those structural shifts is very well addressed by our video this week from John Oliver, which is a required watch. And I hope you've seen it before you came here. But if not, please do go take a look at it. It really does a lot to explain some of the issues that are facing contemporary journalism today and what we can do to help change that. Part of the appeal to algorithms, part of the expansion of things like data journalism also sees the expansion of things like clickbait and the way that stories designed to draw our attention through hyperlinks or quizzes or anything like that that's often being used actually as forms of market research are often mixed in with our news sites. And so online news is often dubious, and there are so many directions that one can go that are really questionable. Another interesting development in our current news landscape, though, is that small community papers are actually performing better. The authors in our textbook argue that this is because these outlets are locally more trusted than our large news outlets. in part because of all of the things we're talking about online news sources, large online news sources in particular, being connected to advertising, to algorithmic analysis and market research, and the desire to keep our attention. So small local papers, often tied to universities and other small communities, have a much more loyal readership, and they aren't tied to the same revenue structures that these large news outlets are, that we're often quite distrusting of legitimately, which sometimes also allows these small papers more flexibility in the types of stories that they can cover and allows them to tackle more controversial issues, especially local controversial issues, things like ordinances and small local laws that have great impacts on people's lives. There are also many more models for journalism that we're seeing called for today, including the push for public and national news funding and nonprofit papers and those tied to universities. And these models are trying to provide new business structures and format that allow the news to thrive as their ability to make money in previous and traditional ways is being diminished. So some of the important alternative voices in journalism landscape today also are those that are provided to us through citizen journalism, or what's often sometimes called citizen media or community journalism. These are often activist or amateur journalists that use digital media technologies like phone videos to disseminate news and information that's often ignored by the mainstream press. Citizen journalism has seen a lot of success in the digital age. And because of this, large-scale news organizations are even trying to hire citizen journalists as freelance journalists to broaden the scope of what they cover in the news, especially as their budgets decrease. Citizen journalism is also a more inexpensive way to access important information and journalist stories than to maintain staff writers. But what's really important about citizen journalism is that you also get to see a lot of things that wouldn't necessarily appear and things that can kind of counter the interpretive versions of events that are coming from large-scale newspapers and other press sites. So this was really important in the age of the movement for Black lives. It was because of citizen journalism that people became more aware of some of the underlying issues of police brutality. It was also because of citizen journalism that we had important counters to the way that certain news sites were presenting what was happening among protest groups. The authors of our textbook conclude by discussing the connections between the newspapers and between newspapers and democracy. And it's important to remember that in the United States in particular, the three branches of government have often been considered to be supplemented by the media as a way to keep checks and balances on what it is that we're being told directly by our governments. And so the media has been referred to as the fourth estate, and an important part of maintaining democracy is an informed citizenry. So they argue that journalism is this vital part of a democratic society because it allows citizens to be informed about what's happening in society and culture and politics. As digital culture continues to grow and as it continues to change newsrooms, it's important to pay attention to the ways that this is transforming people's access to information, but also the types of news that is available to us. So we need to think carefully about the sources of news and the potential positives and benefits that come with this more diverse set of news sources and reporting available to us online, and also some of its potential drawbacks. Local reporting, as we talked about in these smaller papers, can challenge people's mistrust and insecurity about large-scale news, but it also does a lot of very important work of presenting us with information and resources that might not be available to us if we are less connected. Broadcast news media has gone down as well and is often still very nationally focused rather than locally. So we're losing a lot of access to important local information that helps us respond to disasters and crises. Even in the face of all of this, we're still seeing declining subscriptions. So we really do need to think about how we can fund papers in a way that might not be so based in maintaining the interests of advertisers. And to restate John Oliver's point, I hope that you will consider supporting a paper of importance to you, hopefully a local paper. That's all the notes we have for the newspaper section of this week's 2-chapter lecture. So head over to the second one on magazines, and at the end of that, you'll see a breakdown on some of the notes on homework assignments for the week. I'm sorry that we're late this week. Again, thank you for your understanding. See you on the next one.